Throughout cinema, the male gaze has remained a pillar of film culture. Through modern feminist theories, the long-term effects and defiance of such patriarchal standards can be analyzed in both traditional and modern cinema. In this comparative study, I will be analyzing the depiction of female protagonists through the feminist theories male and female gaze in the two films The Housemaid, released in South Korea in 1960, and Lady Bird, released in the United States in 2017. These two films are worthy of analysis due to their varying cultural contexts of post-Korean War South Korea and fourth-wave feminist United States that both treat women as the center of the story, The Housemaid through a male gaze and Lady Bird through a female gaze, allowing ample discussion of the portrayal of female protagonists in cinema. Through their 57-year age gap and Western versus Korean ideals, their varying depictions of powerful women that move the narrative are maintained clearly, with The Housemaid using a female focus to villainize and Lady Bird using a female focus to empower through cinematic elements including cinematography and mise-en-scène. These two contrasting takes on a female focus illuminate a discussion of feminist theory that remains prevalent across cultures and decades. The Housemaid is a 1960 thriller directed by Kim Ki-young. It is the story of a newly employed housemaid who seduces married Mr. Kim and also becomes pregnant with his child, which leads to a power battle between the maid and his wife, Mrs. Kim, resulting in Mr. Kim's forced participation in a joint suicide with the maid. The film was produced just a few years after the Korean War, which left South Korea with greater Western influence than ever before. Kim Ki-young's negative depiction of modern Western culture through the housemaid character shows a strong cultural resistance to Westernization in an attempt to maintain traditional Korean values that placed women as nurturing homemakers and mothers. Lady Bird is a 2017 coming-of-age story directed by Greta Gerwig that takes place in 2002 Sacramento and showcases the various elements of fourth-wave feminism, most specifically the representation of the female gaze. Lady Bird follows a year in the life of high school senior Christine, who has given herself the name Lady Bird. The film explores her experience in a lower middle-class household and her very complicated relationship with her mother.
Your mom's hard on you.
Yeah, well, she loves me a lot.
The film was produced in the mid to late 2010s in the United States, the time of fourth-wave feminism's Me Too movement, in which women fought for reproductive rights and against sexual harassment, among other issues. This is shown through Greta Gerwig's depiction of female characters as complex and powerful human beings. This comparative study will analyze the depiction of female protagonists in The Housemaid and Lady Bird through the use of characterization, cinematography with a focus on movement and framing, and mise-en-scène with a focus on wardrobe. Characterization. In Kim Ki-young's The Housemaid, women are depicted through a strong male gaze. The two female characters, the wife, Mrs. Kim, and the maid, Myung-suk, are pitted against each other from the start of the story, both wanting a relationship with Mr. Kim. Feminist theorist Claire Johnston theorizes classic cinema's myth of women, which is embodied through Mrs. Kim. At the start of the film, Mrs. Kim is the ideal Korean housewife, who is beautiful, graceful, and a homemaker. In the first scenes of the film, when Mr. Kim suggests that having an affair with a maid isn't a ridiculous concept, Mrs. Kim replies,
여보세요. 신성한 가정에서 그런 말과 행동은 안 했으면 좋겠어요.
showing her values as a traditional Korean housewife. She only acts manipulatively and violently to protect her family from the housemaid toward the end of the film. Myung-suk is a much more rebellious and modern character who acts with authority and seduction. She smokes, dresses in Western clothes, and acts flirtatiously.
여보.
미쳤니?
뭐 잘못됐어요?
다시는 여보라고 부르지 마.
Her character has minimal dialogue that keeps the depiction of her character strictly villainous and hysterical. The characterization of the two women into stark categories of mother and villain exhibits a male gaze that generates external conflict to drive the narrative. The female protagonist Lady Bird in Greta Gerwig's Lady Bird is depicted throughout the film to emphasize her imperfection as a real human being discovering herself in her teenage years, rather than a two-dimensional character to build external conflict. Regardless of Lady Bird's decisions, she is always the moving force in the story, never sorry for her presence but loud in it.
Christine?
Lady Bird.
Is that your given name?
Yeah.
Why is it in quote?
Well, I gave it to myself. It's given to me by me.
Okay.
Lady Bird's character strives to rebel in hopes of escaping the social inadequacy she feels from her lower middle-class upbringing, as shown through her confrontational attitude, pink hair, and name, giving her character developed intentions for her rebellion. Gerwig deliberately does not characterize Lady Bird to fit the image of the ideal woman, but rather depicts her as nuanced and relatable. This depiction enacts a clear female gaze and generates feminist theorist Laura Mulvey's concept of recognition, the viewer able to connect with Lady Bird through girlhood. Laura Mulvey defines the concept of recognition as a moment when an older fascination with looking collides with the initial inklings of self-awareness. This is even further enforced by the 2002 setting that appeals to the strong nostalgia of 2017 American audiences, furthering the emotional connection between Gerwig and the audience without the need for visual pleasure. Despite the women being depicted as the driving force in the story and acting out of rebellion, the difference between the two-dimensional and complex female protagonists can be credited to the varying intentions of the directors. Kim Ki-young attempting to villainize Western ideals through the manipulative and seductive Ma Young-suk, and Greta Gerwig's attempt to illuminate the nuances of girlhood, invoking nostalgia for the early 2000s. Cinematography. Through the cinematography during the housemaid sex scene, a clear male gaze is established. In the scene, Ma Young-suk seduces and traps Mr. Kim into a sexual interaction. The scene does not display any sexual acts, as that would have not been considered socially acceptable in 1960 South Korea, yet Ma Young-suk is heavily sexualized. As she slowly undresses, the camera lingers on her nakedness as Ma Young-suk looks away. Mr. Kim looks directly at her bare back, a perfect example of Ma Young-suk's to-be-looked-atness and Mr. Kim's scopophilia, both terms used by Laura Mulvey and defined as to-be-looked-atness, appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact. Scopophilia, pleasure in using another person as an object of sexual stimulation through sight. The camera then cuts to her exposed back, bare legs, and feet, the fragmented nature depicting her body as an object to gaze upon by Mr. Kim and the male audience. However, contrary to Laura Mulvey's visual pleasure in narrative cinema, Ma Young-suk's sexualization is not completely meaningless to the narrative, as it leads to her falling pregnant with his child. In contrast, in Lady Bird, a female gaze can be seen prominently in the cinematography of the sex scene. Despite the camera never cutting away from the sex, the camera remains on their faces, never tracking down to show off her body. The scene focuses much more on the emotional aspect of Lady Bird's first time, rather than the sexual aspect, unlike the housemaid. However, we still see a gaze, albeit through a female perspective. In all of Lady Bird's romantic relationships, she is the seeker and initiator of the relationship. This can be seen as she watches Danny and Kyle at first sight and her first interactions.
There are big, tall, terrible giants in the sky.
Hey,
Hi.
hey. I like your band.
Lady Bird is depicted at a closer medium shot, and the boys are depicted at a further distance in a separate shot that emphasizes her as the gazer. Lady Bird lustfully gazing at both her male counterparts while they are unaware reinforces her power in the narrative. This can be linked to the fourth wave feminist movement that placed an emphasis on women's sexual autonomy and empowerment, not making sex shameful, but something that is a part of life. This is similar to the housemaid sex scene, which serves as an authentic stepping stone in the narrative, despite Ma Young-suk's sexualization. Similar to how Lady Bird's scene shows her self-actualization journey through a real moment in her adolescence that is not glamorized or villainized by keeping the camera focused on her experience. Costume. Through the costumes of the housemaid, the characterizations of female protagonists are made clear through a male gaze. Mrs. Kim wears a lightly colored traditional hanbok, which shows her modesty and traditional Korean values. Ma Young-suk wears a Western-type black dress that might be considered revealing by conservative Korean audiences. Mrs. Kim's character exists as the image of woman, a character that contradicts the existence of real, flawed, and dimensional women, and Ma Young-suk's outfits demonstrate her exhibitionism to Mr. Kim and the audience. However, she uses this to her advantage to move the story, not stop it. In Lady Bird, Lady Bird's clothing is modest and funky, representative of her personal interests separate from boys and sexualization. Through her Catholic uniform, we see her discomfort in the clothing through its poorly fitted appearance in contrast with her normal clothes. Despite Catholic uniform's history of sexualization in media, Lady Bird is never sexualized in the uniform, nor her peers. Lady Bird's clothing does not exist to be looked at through men's preconceived notions of expectations of women. Through fourth wave feminism, female expression is embraced through creative mediums such as clothing, as shown through Lady Bird. In conclusion, the two films depict the agency of women in two different manners. The housemaid capitalizes on the tension built through external conflict of two-dimensional characters that emphasizes their sexuality and actions, but not their experiences as women. Lady Bird treats the portrayal of women with a greater delicacy and realism that uses the complexities of emotion to build meaningful relationships and natural conflicts through a female gaze. Despite their differences, the two films act as stepping stones in the development of feminist cinema, their respective ideals grounded in their respective cultural contexts.